Hello everyone and welcome back to the high level chess course. I hope you've had a chance to watch the previous videos, and if you've got any feedback, just let me know. Today, just before I go on to the lesson itself, I want to direct you towards the intermediate video this week. Now, normally I would say, that maybe those videos are perhaps you'll be on them, but this week, I think there's a particularly interesting theme that I'd like you to check out in the intermediate video. The idea of a windmill. You may well have heard of this in chess. There's a couple of really nice examples where it occurs. So I'd advise you to check that out. Today, though, we're going to look at a game from, I think it's from like 1938, I think it is. It's a Russian game. But perhaps before that, I'll show you a little puzzle. Here we are. You'll be able to see this now. By the way, when we do get onto the game itself, try to avoid looking on the right-hand side because the moves come up. There's not much I can do about that, but it's just to make sure that I don't make a mistake when I'm actually going through it. So here's the puzzle that I want you to do first of all. It's white to move, and only one move on this board saves white, because notice that black is dominant. If we move our king away from this pawn, then, well, that's going to be game over, because again, black can capture this pawn and 3 against 1 will be enough to win. So what can we do? That's the question. How can we save the game as white? Take your time and pause the video. Okay, notice that, we can't go back. So if we go back, then black will just take the pawn, and then this pawn, and then most likely win the game quite quickly. So there's a very cool move here, which is king h5. Okay, so I don't know if you spotted that, and more importantly, if you spotted the reason why that is a good move. So notice that after this move, there's a little dash that comes up at the top here, which means it's the end of the game, and it's stalemate. The white king can't move, and neither of these pawns can move either. So that's a draw. So white's achieved his objective. I'm just going to go back. After king h5, well, you might think, well, what would happen after king f4 or king f3? Well, the answer is the same thing. It's stalemate. There's no way for the king to run away. So black can't actually approach the white king. So if we just do something like this, then the king can just come out again, and we're back to the same situation that we were in before. So we would manage to draw. White would manage to draw by repetition, through repetition, or stalemate after one of these 3 moves by black. Okay, so that was, and I think, a nice little warm-up puzzle. I always like stalemate puzzles. I think they've got this inherent interest in them. Anyway, I'm going to now skip to the game that I wanted to show you. As I say, try not to look on the right-hand side, which reveals the moves, but I'd like you to set up this position on your board at home if you've got a proper board at home. It's a game, I'm just going to refer to my book that I was using just to set this up. It's a game between a guy called Kotov and Polyak, and it was actually 1937, not 38. So first of all, let's assess the position. So material is the first factor, so let's compare pieces. Queen versus queen, rook against rook, rook against rook, bishop against bishop, knight against knight. So we know that the big pieces are equal. And we can probably see as well that white has got 7 pawns and black also has 7 pawns. Okay, so material is equal. What about control of the center? Well, again, I would say reasonably equal, but I think that white has greater control overall. So notice that this is white square. This square is sort of contested by both sides, so it's not really one or the other. This square is controlled by white, and this square is controlled by black. So white has an advantage of 2 against 1, effectively. Okay. Now, notice, I think, well, maybe I'll ask you, what do you notice about this position that is significant in terms of kings? Well, notice that they're on opposite sides of the board. Okay, so white's castle queen side, black's castle king side. The question now is, how do we go about attacking the enemy king? Notice that we're pretty well developed, so it's not like we can improve pieces particularly. I suppose you could argue that maybe this rook could be improved, but you'll see in a second exactly what I mean in terms of attacking the enemy king. How would you go about this as white? How would you target this enemy king? Again, maybe a sort of 50-50. Would you use pawns to attack, or do you use pieces? As in the big pieces. The answer is actually that you would use pawns. Now, the rule is, with kings on opposite sides of the board, the best thing to do is launch a pawn storm. A pawn storm is when you just basically throw forward pawns like this, gradually reaching the enemy king, and you hope to break open the defenses around it. Meanwhile, black will try to do the same sort of thing, most likely using this pawn. Notice that this pawn on a3 is a target for black, because it's basically, once this pawn gets down here, it can engage the pawn on a3. Notice with the pawn on a2, the 3 pawns in a row, and they can't be engaged by an enemy black pawn until this pawn gets down to the 6th rank, or well, the 3rd rank from white's point of view. So this is a bit of a target for black. So how do you go about starting an attack? Well, the move that Kotov played was pawn to g4. So we know already kind of what white is planning. So I'm going to sort of play through this fairly quickly. Again, you can kind of predict the moves as we go along, and then we'll see some of the nuances of how Kotov continued to attack. So after this move, well, the reason for this, by the way, is that basically the defense of this pawn, and also with the idea of pushing this pawn up. That's something I perhaps neglected to point out. This is a bit of a weakness for black, because well, I suppose he could protect it with this pawn, then that would somewhat restrict the queen, and it would weaken the dark squares around black's queen side. In the circumstances, I think pawn to c6 might not have been the worst idea, but the idea is that black wants to try to launch this pawn forward to engage white's pawn. Okay, so after h4, black starts his own initiative with b5. So I guess you could, in this position, go straight in with a move like this and attack black's knight. I suppose the issue is, let's just sort of see a variation of this after g5. Well, I suppose most likely the knight will go back to, well, I think certainly the knight will go back to e8. It's the only possibility. Now, we can't really move that pawn up immediately because black will, I think, take the pawn on g5. And again, if we move this pawn up to here, notice that black can just sidestep. Black can just push this pawn here. And we're actually, our own pawns are blocking our attack. Notice that this rook is blunted by the white pawns rather than the black pawns. This is actually a very good defensive technique you may want to use in your games. So let's just see what happened in the game. Notice that in order to engage black's pawns, white's got to move the pawns up to g6 and h6. So it's useful, therefore, to have as much control as possible over those squares. So if you saw this move, I'll be very impressed, white played the move queen to d3. The idea being that actually this is a weak, perhaps bringing the queen into here, or maybe attacking down to the h7 pawn, or perhaps more importantly, attacking this square, which can be used later on by this pawn. Okay, it's important that the two pawns advance together. Notice that again, if that pawn ends up here, then black can just sidestep. It's perhaps more effective to push this pawn up, because after pawn here, then there's maybe a chance of a sacrifice on g6. So that would perhaps be too dangerous for black. So I suppose this pawn in a way it could come up to there. After this, maybe black would consider blocking. Anyway, black decides to kind of run away, in the sense that he knows he's going to be attacked by this pawn. So he's thinking, well, how about if I just run away first, then maybe I can bring the knight here, maybe here, just to try to disturb the pawns around white's king. I think that move may have been a mistake, though. It may have been better to perhaps try to swap off white's knight in that situation, because the knight is quite a crucial attacker. It's attacking this square here, which is going to be useful for us to push the pawn forward. So I would probably recommend bishop d6 in that situation. But anyway, knight e8 was played, and you can probably guess now what white's going to play. He plays perhaps the more aggressive of the two moves, which I think is this. Okay, black could perhaps block, but I just feel that even after that, white may well consider some kind of sacrifice. It's interesting. Notice as well that this pawn is still quite weak. I think I'm actually wondering about bishop g5. I think bishop g5 could be an option. But no, that wasn't the move that was chosen. The move that was chosen was rook f6. The idea being that the rook could swing across to perhaps defend this pawn, or more in an aggressive sense, to come to a6 or maybe even b6 to help this pawn come forward. So it's a kind of what's called a rook lift. We call it a rook lift. It's both defensive and aggressive, trying to control the sixth rank, sorry. It's a reasonable move, but it does provide white with a target. And you could probably guess the next move, pawn to g5. So basically, any pieces that are in the way of a pawn storm are going to be advantageous to the attacker. So what I mean is, if white can gain time by pushing these pawns forward, then that's good. He can gain a tempo by attacking this rook. The rook is then forced to move, which is not necessarily what black wants. I think in this situation he was keen to move the rook anyway, but white effectively gains a move by attacking the rook, and it's like, imagine pressing fast forward on a film or something. You know, you're gonna watch things much more quickly, and that's good in chess. If you can progress your attack more quickly, then you're more likely to win the game, of course. I'm going to show you what happens. Rook d6. The move queen f5 was played here. The reason being that it ties black's pieces to this weakness, the pawn. It's possible that black could try this, but it does restrict the rook quite heavily. And perhaps black was keen not to do that in order to maximize his attacking chances, perhaps. So he just goes for the move b4. So notice that after pawn takes pawn, there'll be a checkmate threat on b2. So we can't afford to ignore this. I think an interesting move might have been to push the pawn up to a4. I'm sure there's something wrong with it that I might have missed. But you know, that's often a good tactic. If you're attacked, then you can often just bypass. I suspect maybe the instant move pawn to b3 might have been the reason why white didn't play that, because then maybe it weakens, the pawn on a4 would be quite weak on that square. It wouldn't be protected. So instead of that, we have pawn takes pawn, followed by not followed by a recapture. This is actually a really interesting move. Instead of recapturing immediately, black decides to sacrifice this pawn in order to open up more lines against white's king, which is a far better way of attacking, because it means that the attack progresses much quicker. So even at the cost of a pawn, black is happy to progress the attack. So instead of taking this, white focuses on his own attack. Notice that white is actually much quicker. Because of the time that was gained against the rook, white has managed to move these pieces up much more quickly. And the knight also moved back because it would have been attacked. So white's gained 2 moves, black's perhaps gained 1. So after knight, notice that, okay, queen f7 is a threat now. So obviously the fork. So if black bypasses, then we have that fork. If black takes, well, it's not great either, because we still have the same situation. Pawn takes pawn, and the threat remains. So the move is knight f6. This is simply to block, okay? And we also want to maybe release one of these pieces from defending our pawn here. But now, this next move, pause the video and see if you can work out what this next move is going to be. I like this move a lot. I'm quite a fan of it, because we have this really nice situation where we're attacking black's defenses with our 2 pawns rather. I'm just going to quickly read you what was written about this move in the book. It's a very nice language. It says, a colourful looking position. White's pawns have flung themselves bodily onto the enemy bayonets. Their endeavours meet with energetic assistance on the part of the remaining white pieces. So basically, white is using those pawns to blast his way through to the enemy king. Okay, so I'm just going to show you the conclusion of this game. Pawn takes pawn. Again, threatening mate with the queen. That's quite crucial. So we're creating threats, CCTV, checks, captures, threats, and violence. Okay, on the chessboard, that is. So queen is threatening mate. Queen is threatening violence, you could say. Bishop f8 to defend the mate. Pawn up now to h7. Notice that if I want to show you quickly, if the king goes into the corner, we have, I think, a really quite a cool idea, which is that we can bring our queen here, and then bring the knight into g6 with mate. So that's something that black can't risk. He simply takes this. Queen takes. And then after this, can we find another check? Well, yes, CCTV, checks. Okay. Again, notice that I suppose if black blocked this, then there would be options to, I would imagine, take that pawn, or indeed maybe, and then perhaps take that pawn as well. Okay, so there's several problems with that. That may have been an alternative, but the move that was played was king g8, so just retreating back to where he came from. After king e8, I think then there's moves such as rook down here, and maybe even knight in there. So it's very, very dangerous for black. King g8. And after knight g6, we're threatening mate on h8 there. Notice that the king is stuck, can't go here. So rook f6 blocks the queen, so it gives black a way out, temporarily at least. Rook comes down anyway, king comes out, and now a nice little combination to finish the game. Knight to e5, the king must go onto the e file, and both of these moves end up with the checkmate, queen takes pawn. Okay, I think I'm just going to very quickly recap. This was probably the key position. We used our kingside pawns, we launched them forward very carefully with the help of our pieces. Notice that all of these pieces are working together. And we enabled ourselves to carve open the enemy defenses. And notice that here we're not reacting that much to what black is doing. We're trying to just go for our own attack, because if we react to what black is doing, we are actually helping black, because we're basically reacting, and that means the black's attack will progress much quicker. Anyway, you can look at that game. It's Kotov, Polyak, 1937. If you want to see the conclusion, or in fact the beginning of that game, then you can do that now. Hope that was helpful. So pawn storms are useful when you castle on the opposite side to the enemy. So give that a go in your games, and best of luck. See you next time.